How you doing?
Good. How are you? Good to see
Uh,
you.
Likewise, very, very good to see you. I don't know if the producers told you, but I was very excited for this interview.
I heard.
Um,
Yes. Yeah.
so I'm not entirely sure how much you have talked about the book, but I would definitely like to, if you can just talk more about what inspired you to speak about Queen of the Moor. You know, Queen of the Moor being a nationalist and a woman at that. And I'm asking this question because, as I'm sure you are aware, when people speak about Black nationalism, at least in circles I've been in, there's oftentimes concern about um, how women are treated within those circles and whether they have a voice. So I'm just curious as to your upbringing. If you can just speak to your exposure to this great ancestor and
Mhm.
what inspired you to write about her.
Absolutely. So I would say there's two things. I first encountered Queen Mother Moore when I was a young kid through the book called I Dream a World, and it had portraits of Black women. And the portrait that you see here, that's on the cover of the book, was my first exposure to Moore. My mother, who is a woman who graduated from Fisk. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. Somebody who loved history, but in her day and age, never thought that she could be a historian for a living, used to instill upon me the importance of Black women in all of these movements. And once I started researching and writing about Black women as my career, my first book called Remaking Black Power, I interviewed probably 30 to 40 activists, and almost everybody had a story about Queen Mother Moore. It was the first time that they had heard anybody talk about reparations from her. It was the first time they'd ever heard about Garvey, right? They talked about the way that she could walk across the stage and inspire and move people to action in support of African liberation and what was happening with police brutality down the street. And so I had to know more about her. And when I did, I found out that there really wasn't much about her. I couldn't find anything beyond kind of a couple of interviews and blog posts from folks that hadn't known her and met her. And I was absolutely astonished that someone who lived from 1898 to 1997, who had been a part of the Garvey movement, the Communist Party movement, the Republic of New Africa, the Million Man March, had not been documented in her full kind of glory and entirety.
For those who aren't aware, would you mind just speaking about the PGRNA, the Republic of New Africa?
Yeah, absolutely. I love talking about this because it gives me a chance to tell a really great story about Queen Mother Moore. So I want to emphasize that here from the 1920s to the 1960s, Moore always advocated for Black people to have a separate Black nation. And she moved that idea not just from immigrating back to Africa, but actually having a separate Black nation on US soil. And so when people started to kind of think seriously about this idea in the late 1960s in Detroit, she was one of the people that was at the kind of forefront of creating this organization. And I love telling this story because folks say that when they kind of went to this unfurled this document that was a declaration for a separate Black nation on US soil, people got a little skittish about actually signing it. But Moore walked to the front and was one of the first signatories of the declaration because it embodied the ideals that she had been fighting for at that point for the better part of 50 years, right? The fact that Black people were a free and separate people, the fact that integration into the United States was futile, that America, as it were, is a failed project in terms of, kind of racial harmony. The fact that Black people are owed reparations and that money should be used as the seed money to start a separate Black nation, and that this could connect us back to our heritage of Africa more broadly. So Moore functioned for the first couple of years in the PGRNA as it started to develop across the nation in northern cities, and as they started to develop their own plebiscite down in Jackson, Mississippi in the early 1970s. So when people talk about Black nationalism as some kind of like pie in the sky ideal that can never come true, that just is not historically accurate. We have and continue to create formulations that bring these ideals to real people on the ground.
You know, and just to build off your point, the plebiscite ideal itself just comes out of this notion that out of the Civil War and Reconstruction, we weren't, as
Mhm,
African people, given a choice to
mhm,
declare our citizenship. They sort of imposed that on us.
mhm,
And another point you brought up was in reference, I like how you connected reparations or even nationhood to Africa, in that
Mm-hmm.
vein between the Garvey movement and the PGRNA.
Mm-hmm.
My next question is in regards to reparations. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this whole FBA and ADOS movement that's popping up in recent years. You know, um, I just wanted to get your take on that.
Mm-hmm.
How does Queen Mother Moore sort of dispel this notion that reparations is something that only can be fought within the framework of being an African American? How does she dispel this notion of us needing to use ethnocentrism in order to advance reparations? If that
Yeah,
makes
no, I think
sense.
that, yeah, no, that's a really great question. So, Moore started really advocating for reparations in the late 1950s, early 1960s. So during a time when, people, this really seemed like a very fringe thing, not something that is in kind of our everyday vernacular every day. But I would say that at its core, Moore was not just arguing about reparations for slavery, though she did think that Black people deserved that. But writing in the 1960s, she was also talking about that we deserved reparations for the afterlives of slavery, all of the years of cultural, economic, mental, psychological, um, physical, right? Degradation, dehumanization that we had been through. And that means that even if you could not trace yourself directly as a descendant of a enslaved person in the United States, you still have been wronged, right? And you were still owed something from the aftermath of what slavery and racism and Jim Crow had produced, right? So her argument moved just beyond kind of payment for actual labor to payment for the range of atrocities that Black folk had endured. And so it doesn't really matter whether or not you can trace your lineage directly to a slave that was working in the American South, because as a Black person, you've been wronged and the government owes you something. Also, as a Black person, I say, I think Queen Mother Moore was certainly about making that wrong right, but she also, I think, saw reparations as a way to kind of heal some of the ruptures of the Middle Passage, right? She didn't think that we should take the money and integrate into American society, but she thought that we should take the money and start to kind of create a revolution of our minds, where we let go of this idea of Americanness in general and recaptured our understanding and relationship to Africa. So for her, it was certainly about a wrong for the past, but it was also about building a different African-centered future. And that just doesn't work if you stick to kind of ethno-nationalist notions of reparations.
You know why I like your answer, if I may, for just a
Mm,
second. I like how you
sure.
use that word lineage. I'm not sure if
Mhm.
you did that intentionally, but that
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
definitely. All right, so just in that same vein, right? Please paint a
Mhm.
picture for us. So,
Mhm.
within 1960s, 70s, we're still in
Mhm.
this time period before the Gary Convention, where
Mhm.
nationalist sentiments and integrationist sentiments are still, you know, neck and neck.
Mhm.
Integrationism hasn't quite taken over the Black community just yet. Can you
Mhm.
just, in that frame of time, speak about Queen Mother Moore's impact as it relates to, assisting John Conyers in Congress and just others? How did she add to the conversation at that time around reparations, if I am getting the history correct
Mhm.
in that
Yeah.
sense?
I love this question because it gives me opportunity to talk about kind of where the origins of the modern reparation movement comes from. And it actually comes from Moore's group called the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women, which you can see her, kind of reaching back to her Garvey roots in that, right? And really, this is a band of middle-aged Black women in New Orleans that by day are getting Black men off of death row for allegedly raping white women and making sure Black women got enough to eat. And by night, basically creating the architectural framework of modern Black nationalism. How are they doing that? One, they're thinking about the fact that, in Moore's words, somebody needs to pay for all of this, right? For the atrocities that Black people are experiencing in the Jim Crow South all the way back to slavery. And two, the idea that, integration is really futile among unequal people. So what can we use this money to build with instead of trying to, kind of seal up cracks in a crumbling building? And so because of that, she is really actually like literally writing pamphlets and distributing pamphlets talking about the case for reparations in terms of past precedent, about enumerating the atrocities that Black people have experienced, and then offering a framework for how repayment could work while things like the March on Washington are going on. right? And she's spreading this. She's literally sometimes going from place to place, from a church to a community group to a nationalist group, and letting anybody who will listen talk about it. And so I see her as kind of really planting the seeds of that, all while maybe everybody's looking towards the March on Washington. And as we get the Civil Rights Act, as we get the Voting Rights Act, and Black life doesn't really improve that much, then you see folks kind of coming back to Moore's idea that really you cannot integrate until you are an equal. And the only way to integrate and become equals is, to right the wrongs that have made in the past. So it really is this moment where everybody is focused on sit-ins and the March on Washington, and she is literally going in the opposite direction and galvanizing people for a wholly different understanding of their relationship to the American nation state.
All right, so we got a lot of directions we can go in.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to get kind of tangential here. Can you
Okay.
please just talk about Ethiopianism?
Mm-hmm.
Because to your point, this band of women, and back then
Mm-hmm.
during that time, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people of our people were using Ethiopian in their vernacular. So,
Mm-hmm.
what is the importance of that? Of that mind state, Ethiopianism. What is it,
Yeah.
and what is its significance?
So Moore is kind of first introduced to the concept of Ethiopia as both like a real place that has never been colonized, right, by white folks in Africa, and as an idea of kind of the cradle of Black civilization. And that's something that Garvey really instilled in her back in the 1920s when she was in her 20s, and really having this awakening and nationalist becoming and Pan-Africanist becoming, right? And then she kind of felt it in a really tangible way when in 1935 Italy tried to invade Ethiopia, and she was part of a group in Harlem that was sending supplies and fighting back against this, right? And then so now she's invested in it not just as an idea of like the cradle of Black civilization, but also as in a real place where Black people are practicing nationhood and self-determination, right? So by the time we get to the 1950s and 60s, she and other former Garveyites really hold on to the idea as a way to kind of signal their nationalist politics, as a way to assert their desire for African decolonization, and also to inspire those around them with the idea that Black people have a whole lineage and a whole history and a whole actual physical space that quite frankly has nothing to do with white folks, and that's what they should be galvanizing around. So it certainly was an idea, but for her, it was a very real understanding of what it was like to put Black nationalist principles into action.
Yeah, that brings to mind for me Psalm chapter 68, verse
Mm-hmm.
31. You
Mm-hmm.
know, so clarifying question, Queen
Mm-hmm.
Mother Moore and the
Mm-hmm.
Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, were they
Mm-hmm.
contemporaries, or was there a mentor-mentee relationship? I'm not quite clear on that
Yeah,
history.
they were definitely contemporaries. So actually, Moore was born fairly well off. She was actually living a pretty great life as one can live as a Black girl in Jim Crow, Louisiana, in New Orleans. But she was orphaned and slid down the class ladder. And I think this opened her eyes to kind of the degradation around the world. But she married a Jamaican sailor. Jamaica is where Marcus Garvey originated and where the UNIA originated, and he introduced her to Garveyism. And if you'll give me a little bit of lead time, I'd love to tell the story that she tells about it, because I think it really captures her spirit. So I want you to imagine that it's the early 1920s, 1922. Moore went from being this kind of woman who had maids and nannies to being a maid and nanny in white women's household. And she is walking to the Longshoremen's Hall in New Orleans, Louisiana. This is like a 2-story, very traditional structure. It's got those shutters that we all know to remind us of the Gulf South. And she says she's walking slow because she's got a 45 in her bra, another in her pocketbook, and that her husband has a suitcase full of bullets, right? And as she's walking into the Longshoremen's Hall, they're asking, everybody is trying to figure out if Marcus Garvey's going to speak tonight. And that's because he came to New Orleans, which was a stronghold for the UNIA. And he was arrested because he could rouse Black people to nationalist action like that, right? And so they're ready to defend him with guns. So as she tells it, Marcus Garvey comes bounding down the middle of the benches, and the police threaten to arrest him. And everybody raises their guns in kind. And they say, "Speak, Garvey, speak. Speak, Garvey, speak," right? And she says they put their guns away And she hears Marcus Garvey talk about, ancient Africa, talk about the fact that she should be proud of her skin and her hair, talk about the fact that the same things happen to Black people in Cairo are the same things happen in South Carolina, which are the same things happening in Cuba, which are the same things happening in Canada. And she starts to kind of put it all together. And she becomes a Garveyite then and there, right? And so, Garvey leaves after that, about 5 years after that, when he's deported by the federal government. But she is, in many ways, one of the foremost Garveyites that carries his ideals from the 1920s all the way to the 1990s.
Let's talk about Ghana for a second.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not quite knowledgeable about this, but did Queen Mother Moore by any chance have a relationship with Kwame Nkrumah or with his family or with like any of his progenitors? You know, if you can just delve into that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So, interestingly enough, Queen Mother Moore was a lover of Africa, but she was very wary of going to Africa as a tourist and kind of recapitulating the power hierarchies that she knew was in place. So, she actually did not step foot onto the African continent until she went to Kwame Nkrumah's funeral in 1972. But there, it was very much kind of a political awakening of another moment. And I want to remind folks that she was born in 1898. So by the time it's 1972, she is, in the later stages of her life before she really touches down. So she doesn't actually, she admires Nkrumah, but never actually gets to meet him. But while she is there, she goes to Guinea and sees Sekou Touré. And then this prompts her being invited back to Tanzania several times for different conferences like the All African Women's Conference, the Sixth Pan African Congress. She ends up going to Nigeria. She ends up going to Uganda as the personal guest of Idi Amin, which, if you pick up the book, you'll read about their sordid relationship. So I wouldn't say that she necessarily had a one-to-one relationship with Nkrumah, but through Nkrumah, right, Africa opened up to her. And she was treated as kind of the queen of Black America and feted as such. And she went on about 8 different trips between like 1972 and 1980 to different African countries.
All right, Miss Farmer, we about to go in because
Yeah.
all right. So the Sixth Pan African Congress, right?
Mm-hmm.
As you know, this was the first Pan African Congress after decolonization. A lot
Mm-hmm.
to discuss. To your
Yes.
knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
as a member of the diaspora, Queen Mother
Mm-hmm.
Moore, what did she add to the conversation? What were
Mm-hmm.
her observations as to the diaspora's place in Pan
Mm-hmm.
Africanism at the time?
Yeah, I mean, Queen Mother Moore is an interesting person because basically she's been around for all the Pan African Congresses, more or less, right?
That's
And
true.
this is the
That's
first,
true.
yeah, and that's the first. This is the first one that she actually got to attend, and she's thrilled that it's the first one on African soil, right? Um, so she served not as a delegate but as an observer at that conference, and so a lot of what you see her doing there is kind of moving in and out, talking to people, having audiences with everybody from Nyerere to Amiri Baraka. And if you're a student of that time, you know that there was a huge kind of rift there between the Marxist and the nationalist that took place. And Moore was ardently still on the nationalist side. She felt that people had gone too far into their class politics. She also really advocated for reparations while she was there. When you talk to people that saw her there, that's one thing they remember about it. But she also felt disappointed by it in the end. She didn't feel like there was enough concrete plans coming out of that because people were too working towards too much infighting for there really to make a plan for Black Americans to support, decolonization and nationalism, and for the diaspora to kind of build something separate from Western culture.
To that point, my understanding was that, by that time period, I think it was 75. Yeah, it was
76.
75, 74,
Mhm.
70.
So,
Okay, yeah.
mhm,
So I guess because the newly independent African countries had gotten their
mhm,
independence, I feel like everybody was a big man or woman in their country. So
mhm,
it was, and then in addition to that, the diaspora having known intimately what racism is and was, that
mhm.
was sort of like that struggle, just sort of explaining to the leftists, like, hey, listen,
Mhm.
race is still a factor,
Yep.
so
Mhm.
before we wrap up,
Mhm.
and I wish we can go on longer, but um, again, going back to my original point, the the African woman's place in nationalism.
Hmm.
Not
Yeah.
place, but the African woman as it relates to nationalism. Like,
Hmm.
what can we take away from this? Why is it important that we highlight more of these women, the Queen of the Moors, the Amy Jocks Garveys, you know,
Yeah, the Dara
women like that.
Bubakaris. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so most of the time we think of nationalism as a young black man's game, right? It's the Malcolms, it's the Garvey when he was young, and women seem as kind of helpmates or nothing at all. And I think
Right.
somebody like Moore shows us, one, that that is not true. Not only was she part of every moment in nationalist history in the 20th century, she also midwifed some of them, whether that be through her groups on the ground, like the Universal Association of Ethiopian Women I talked about, whether that was mentoring Malcolm X and other folks who went on to become major nationalist leaders, whether that was creating the infrastructure for things like the Republic of New Africa, and then holding positions of power in those places, right? So I don't want to pretend that they didn't face sexism and that the relationship wasn't complicated, but it wasn't a wholesale women weren't involved or women weren't crucial to it. And I think that's what Moore teaches us.
Ashley D. Farmer, y'all. Please talk to us a bit about your book, how we can get it, if you don't mind.
Yes, so the book is called Queen Mother, Black Nationalism, Reparations, and the Untold Story of Audley Moore. It is a cradle to grave biography of this remarkable woman who lived for 100 years. You can get it at Mahogany Books and any other independent bookseller. And I hope that you'll check it out. And you can find me on socials if you want to tell me what you think about it.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you for engaging with it.
Yes, ma'am.